Hello, my friend, and welcome back. In this video, I'm going to be giving you a distillation of more than 20 years of blood, sweat, and tears, and struggle, and ultimate triumph around becoming a disciplined, productive person. And this is in the arenas of lifestyle, so things like exercise, sleep-wake schedule, that kind of thing, as well as with my music, especially now as I am endeavoring to become a semi-professional musician and get a dedicated income stream from my music. And then my main focus right now, which is this project, Create or Perish, and the composite parts of this project, which are the YouTube channel, the podcast, and the community, as well as various networking and things that are going on behind the scenes to make all of this work. And, this has never come easily to me. In fact, for most of my life, this has been impossible for me, this ability to stay on top of things and basically have multiple plates spinning and keep those plates spinning without them coming crashing down to the ground. And, as far back as elementary school, that's when I was first diagnosed with ADD, I struggled to get my homework turned in. I struggled to even keep track of my homework when I got home. I would lose my glasses, I swear, once a week. I just wasn't plugged into the kinds of things that seemed to come much more easily to other kids. And that persisted. A lot of times people outgrow their ADD. That was not the case for me. I didn't have the hyperactivity component to it, but I definitely had the attentional piece of it, as well as the time blindness, which is one of the main challenges with attention deficit disorder. And then as I got older, I realized that I also had a very healthy dose of what Steven Pressfield would call the resistance. So this is the kind of self-sabotaging set of behaviors like perfectionism and procrastination and self-doubt and, all the ways we put our head in the sand and avoid doing the things that actually need to be done, that are actually going to move the needle. And so, it's been a real struggle for me. It seemed like anytime I would have a creative vision, I would be inspired by something that I wanted to see through, something that I wanted to bring into the world. As soon as I started to approach the threshold where it was time to actually bring it out into the world, to actually push it out of the birth canal as the midwife of the project, invariably the resistance would rear its ugly head, and I would procrastinate on certain things. I would get hyper obsessed about certain things not being right, the perfectionism piece of it. And I just wouldn't do the things that I needed to do. And it's not like I wasn't willing to put in the work. It's not like I was being lazy. I would spend countless hours involved in doing work around things that I was really obsessing over, things that I was really immersed in, the things that really came alive for me in the project. But when it came time to reconcile that kind of immersive, obsessive kind of work with the real world, with the realities of what it actually takes to make something viable, things like being on a production calendar, having a production schedule, posting regularly to social media. I hated social media. Even personally, I was off social media for 10 years, and I just wasn't comfortable there. This idea of developing a personal brand or having a public-facing persona, that was always really challenging for me. And then just the consistency around, following through on the specific things that were necessary to get the plane off the ground they just didn't happen. And so the project would just kind of fade. Things would just kind of fizzle out. The sizzle would fizzle. And, I realized in the immortal words of Tom Waits that I had the sizzle, but not the steak. I didn't have anything at the end of the day that people could actually sink their teeth into. And, this is ultimately what it's all about. You've got to be able to create something, to build something, and bring it to market, and be able to connect with the person who's looking for that thing, and have them be able to sink their teeth into it and get some kind of nourishment from it. And so what I'm going to share with you today is how I've actually been able to do that very thing, to overcome the resistance, to work with the attention deficit disorder, and actually consistently, reliably bring what it is that I'm doing into the marketplace and make a real connection with people who are looking for the things that I'm doing. So what I'm going to be sharing with you today are 6 principles of what I call organic productivity. So organic productivity is the name that I've given to this approach to working with productivity systems and tools. It's not a productivity system in itself. I have a productivity system. It's called the Creative Integrity System. I've got all the detailed information about that in the free community. I'll be touching on the free community here at the end of this video. But what I want to focus on and really highlight here is something that's much more fundamental than the systems that you're using, which is the relationship you have with the system, how you implement the system, and most fundamentally, your relationship with yourself as the operator, as the one who is holding the torch and steering the ship, whatever metaphor you want to use. The person who is taking on the responsibility of this creative project. What is your relationship with yourself as the person who is implementing these systems and these tools to get your project across the starting line and actually into the race? So we're going to be talking about how organic productivity is just radically different from other approaches to productivity, and in particular, how it can help make accessible and usable the kinds of systems and tools that oftentimes for people like us who may tend to be a little bit more artistic or have an ADHD profile, oftentimes the imposition of some kind of structure or some kind of system can feel really uncomfortable. We don't want to paint inside the lines. It's hard to fit a Picasso-inspired peg into a square hole. And so, it's really all about figuring out how to use the tools that we have and the systems that are available. I'm not inventing the wheel here. We're going to be touching on some of these tools. They're the same tools that everybody else uses, but it's really about the way that we go about implementing them and the way that we engage with ourselves as we go about learning how to implement them. So before we jump into it, if you're new here, my name is Paul Jansen. I have a background in holistic health. I practiced as an acupuncturist for 10 years. That was a very formative period of my life and really instilled in me these intuitions and principles around holistic problem solving, really, holistic thinking around how to get to the root cause of a complex problem and approach that through what are often tangential means. So you're not always going directly at the problem, but you're skillfully finding ways to approach the problem For me at the time, it was all about lifestyle change. So regardless of what the person was coming in for, once you had a clear bead on what the underlying cause was, you can approach it with things like lifestyle change and other kinds of behavior modification that will ultimately unlock and resolve the problem. So that was a major kind of shaping, paradigm shaping period of my life. From there, I moved on to pursue my interest in cognitive science. I got absolutely obsessed with cognitive science and ended up enrolling in a master's program at Teachers College at Columbia University. The program was Cognitive Studies in Education. So it was an applied cognitive science program. And the track that I was on was the intelligent technologies track. So this was all about learning how to optimize learning in a digital learning environment. And that set me down a path of a great variety of different explorations, lots of rabbit holes that I ended up falling into oftentimes for a year or two at a time. And it gave me a very eclectic kind of background that has allowed me to see the world and see challenges and approaches to working with those challenges from a lot of different perspectives with a lot of different frameworks. So ADHD, for example, is something that I think you can look at it and understand it from a number of different vantage points. And I had the opportunity when I was at Teachers College, I had the time and the resources, given the library and having the university access to research papers that are oftentimes behind a paywall, to explore ADHD from kind of an academic perspective, through an academic framing. And, there's really interesting stuff about the interaction between neural networks. I'm sure you've heard of the default mode network and other attentional networks, and how through the lens of coherence, there's oftentimes interference between the default mode network and attentional networks. I mean, really interesting stuff, but it's all very abstract. It's a very abstract kind of nerdy framework to understand. It's not very practical. So, also at Teachers College, I had the opportunity to be a part of a GTD group. So this is David Allen's Getting Things Done framework, approach to working with productivity. David Allen's kind of one of the OG productivity guys. And this group met once a week, and we would discuss what we were dealing with. It was mostly around studying and planning for tests and, just being on top of our lives as students. And so that was really insightful for me more on a practical level. I also have read Cal Newport's books on productivity. I've done his masterclass. And I think Cal Newport is probably one of the best resources out there. I also did a few years ago a coaching training program through the Flow Research Collective. And this was all about flow science, but their target demographic were entrepreneurs primarily. So I would say 80% of the material in that program was all about how to manage your work environment, how to set yourself up for success, how to distraction-proof your work environment, how to go with the flow, as it were, with the flow cycle, and recognize there's a struggle phase, and then there's the flow phase, and then you got to take a break and recover. There's a recovery phase. So all kinds of really great stuff around productivity that I learned in that program as well. So, I've soaked up a lot of different things in the productivity world. And as I said, this isn't really, I'm not reinventing the wheel. There isn't anything here in terms of the tools and, the basic fundamentals. It's really, as I said, about how you implement them. And then how you relate to yourself. We're going to be probably wondering what I mean by that, relating to yourself. So let's get into it. So we're going to start with the first three principles here are going to be more kind of 30,000 foot view. They're going to be kind of more high level and more inwardly focused. And then the second set of three principles are going to be more tactical. They're going to be more applied. It's going to be more about actually using the systems on the ground. So the first principle is freedom from structure. So this is speaking to what I was getting at earlier about a Picasso-inspired peg not fitting into a square hole. So we have to recognize if you have resistance to structure and if you have resistance to constraints and, systems and routines and schedules and these kinds of things, we've got to find a way to connect the dots emotionally, experientially between the structure as being the through line to the freedom. The structure is what gives rise to the freedom. And as a musician, I like to think about this through the lens of music. So the rhythm of the music, the structure of that rhythm is what allows for the freedom of the music. So if you think about jazz, for example, if there weren't the steady rhythm and the steady beat, if there weren't the chord changes, the charts that the musicians are following that give the structure to the song, then you wouldn't have anything to improvise over the top of. The whole thing would just be a muddy mess. So, we have to ultimately become timekeepers of our project. And, for me personally, this was always challenging when it had to do with me keeping my own time. I was very good at being on somebody else's schedule. I was always good at school because the schedule was laid out for me. I knew I might procrastinate and do, cram for the test the night before, but I would get it done because the rhythm of the schedule was established for me. I also said I would have done really well in the military because of that structure that's externally provided. But when you take on a solopreneurship endeavor like this, we become responsible for keeping time. And it's that time interface with the real world, with the rest of the world, that we have to make peace with. We have to recognize that is the through line to the freedom that we're looking for. So this is kind of like a mindset thing where we have to learn how to, if we recognize that we resist this, that we have to get our arms around that and see a future in which we have made peace with this and we've embraced this aspect. There's a great quote by Duke Ellington when he was being asked about writing a particular arrangement, and something came up about if he needed more time, and he says, "I don't need more time. What I need is a deadline." All right, so the deadline, the calendar, the schedule, that is kind of a forcing function that then orients and aligns all of the other work that we're doing, right? And so, we're not going to get into this here, but I like to think about there being two kinds of time. There's time one, which is the structured time, the clock time, grandfather time. And then there's time two, which is the subjective time, the time of immersion, the experience of being in real time, I like to think of it, with whatever it is you're immersed in, whether it's music or your project, So you've got to find a way to, interface these two times. And so time one is really where these systems and these tools are all about helping us. And a deadline in terms of 80/20ing how to optimize for getting the traction and the momentum that we're looking for, the deadline is the most powerful lever that you can pull. So getting a deadline on the calendar completely changes, is another kind of conceptual framing, is around input goals and output goals. So output goals are how frequently you're publishing something. You're going to do this every Friday, you're going to do this every Wednesday, you're going to do this twice a week, whatever the case may be. And then you've got the input goals, which is, I've got this time block set up for doing this particular thing. If you don't have a deadline, your inputs just become busyness. You're not actually being productive. And the time that you're spending on doing all the inputs just is infinite. As soon as you have a deadline, I can tell you, I've got a gig tonight as a musician. As soon as you have a gig on the calendar, that back pressure defines all of the inputs that are then necessary to achieve that deadline, right? So, and then that deadline, and this is really, I think, the most important part of what I'm trying to convey here. The deadline is a shipping deadline. This is part of the framework that I work from, the I drop ship. It's all about getting to ship, which is about bringing what you've got out into the world, which is about connecting with the people who are looking for it, which is about them finding value into it, them sinking their teeth into it, you getting the feedback and the engagement from these people. That's where the freedom is. And that freedom comes through having the deadline on the calendar that then influences all of the other work that you're doing. As soon as you get a taste of that, everything that I'm saying makes sense. And the sooner you can get a taste of that, the better, right? So getting some small wins around actually getting what you're doing out to the people who are looking for it, and getting that connection, that lifeblood that comes from that, it makes everything else make sense. It uplifts the whole process, and it just brings a lot of clarity around what it is that you're doing and what needs to be done in order to get it done. All right, so that's the first principle. We're talking about freedom coming from structure. So structure gives rise to the freedom that we're looking for. And it's a liberating constraint. So the second principle that I want to share with you is the business is a chrysalis. So your business, this project that you're inspired to take on, is a chrysalis. It is something where you are going in as a caterpillar and you are coming out as a butterfly. So there's a personal transformation involved in this. I think this is something that is not talked about enough in the world of entrepreneurship, especially purpose-driven, mission-driven projects. There is something that is intimately connected in terms of who you are as a person with the work that you're doing. Typically, the product in some form or fashion is you. You are somehow bringing yourself into the marketplace. And so if you have been somebody who has been more of an introvert or has resisted that kind of thing, then to cross that threshold means that you have to become the kind of person who can get comfortable with that. I like to say with time management, that time management isn't about managing time. Time management is about managing ourselves. Time management is self-management. So if you are not the kind of person who is good at managing your time, you eventually have to become the kind of person who is good at managing your time. You don't have to be world class. Trust me, I am not a world class, time management, ultra disciplined person. But you've at least got to be good at it. And these systems and these tools, if approached the right way, can really help shore that up and assist and provide a kind of scaffolding that we can lean on and help shore up some of these weaknesses. But the transformation is necessary. We have to become the kind of person who is capable of being consistent, of keeping a calendar, of having a public-facing persona, and so on. So that's the second principle. So that invariably, as we start leaning into this, as we start pushing ourselves into the fire, this crucible of transformation, the resistance is going to rear its head. There's going to be a lot of pushback from our internal, subconscious. And these are mechanisms that are intended to try to keep us safe. They're very well-meaning. They come with a lot of experience from our past, a lot of inherited insight into what we need to do to keep ourselves safe. It's very well-meaning, but they are going to knock our knees out from underneath us as we start getting closer to that fire in an effort to protect us. So this is really, when I keep talking about our relationship with ourselves, this is really the third principle is where that really comes into focus. So this is the principle of becoming an elephant whisperer. So this draws from a metaphor that you find oftentimes in the world of neuroscience, particularly in embodied cognition. So we are viewing ourselves, our embodied selves, as being comprised of a rider, which is the conscious, analytical, decision-making, rational aspect of who we are. And we are also comprised of an elephant. This is the second piece of this, which is the implicit, unconscious, nonverbal, largely feeling-based dimension of who we are. And the fact of the matter is that, and this is something that neuroscience and Jungian shadow psychology, depth psychology all agree on, the shadow dimension, the elephant dimension, is much larger and much more influential, much more powerful than the rider. The rider likes to think that he or she is in charge. But in fact, what the rider is best at doing is after the elephant has made a particular decision to go down a particular path, the rider is excellent at coming up with a post hoc explanation as to why he or she, as the decision maker, the rational decision maker, had a rational reason for why that path was chosen. When in fact, whether it was a person you ended up dating or a product you ended up purchasing or some other decision that you made, why you decided not to, ship the YouTube video that you've been working on, or why you didn't do, the thing that you needed to do. There's a post hoc rationalization that happens by the rider to explain why that decision was made, when in fact the decision was made by the elephant. So this is what I'm speaking to when I talk about the relationship with ourselves. I'm primarily talking about the relationship between the rider and the elephant. And oftentimes there has been a breach of trust between the elephant and the rider. There's been a kind of fragmentation and compartmentalization where the rider has become kind of out of tune with, out of touch with what the elephant is saying, wanting, needing, and has been kind of a slave driver and doing things that are very rational and pragmatic, but aren't necessarily inclusive of the deeper desires or the deeper interests or the deeper creative impulses that are coming from the realm of the elephant. And so what oftentimes happens is we have this inspiration that we want to take on a particular endeavor, and we have a vision that needs to take us across a river. And we see on the other side of the river there are other elephants and riders. There's other people who have made that crossing. We know as a rider, intellectually, that it's a safe passage. We can see the lay of the land and we can make a rational assessment of what the situation is. But as soon as we get up to the edge of the banks of that river, the elephant revolts. Right? And this is how I interpret the resistance. The resistance is this internal resistance to taking that step because there's a fear factor and there's a protective impulse and reflex that kicks in from the elephant, and the elephant turns and goes the other way, and we are powerless to do anything about it. I say we're powerless. Some people do find a way to kind of whip the elephant across the river. They have a certain strength of will that allows for that to happen. But to my mind, that only deepens the divide in terms of the fragmentation and the disconnection. And eventually there will be a reckoning. Eventually there will be a point at which that division is no longer sustainable. And there's going to have to be, kind of a reconnection moment or a midlife crisis or whatever the case may be. So why not start now becoming an elephant whisperer? So when we do inevitably unplug from the systems that we're trying to do, we have a certain commitment that we make about the things that we're trying to do. We have a certain goal that we set for ourselves around, a deadline or whatever the case may be, or checklists is a part of the system that I use. If you're finding that you're not doing any of the things on the checklist, the typical response is to meet that with a lot of self-criticism and self-loathing. We beat ourselves up. The kind of language that I would catch myself using with myself is like, what the hell is wrong with you? Why can't you? It's just a shallow river. Why can't you just do this thing? It's so easy. How could you forget to do this thing again? It was just this immense frustration. And when we frame it in this relational way, when we recognize that we have a relationship between the rider and the elephant, and that this kind of self-talk, this kind of energy, this kind of attitude is actually being directed at ourselves and deepening a schism and deepening an internal conflict within ourselves. Why can't you do this? That is actually the very thing that is keeping us from getting where we want to go. So when we find ourselves resisting, when the elephant says, no, I'm not interested in doing that, I'm going to bury my head in the sand for the next 2 weeks, we have to find a way to deal with that is skillful and that is in keeping with this principle of becoming an elephant whisperer. So we're not getting on like the horse whisperer, obviously, is where I'm drawing from. We're not getting on the horse with our spurs and forcing it to submit. We are, in a very kind of Tai Chi or Aikido kind of way, going with whatever is happening and being with ourselves as this is unfolding in a very non-judgmental way. So there's 3 core principles or, kind of sub-principles that I'll share with you around this that I think are really important. The first is radical self-acceptance. All right, and by radical self-acceptance, I'm talking about like delusional self-acceptance. I'm talking about the kind of universal love that, unconditional love rather, that every child in an ideal world should experience from their parents, right? And that's another frame I like to put around this, right? And it's very similar to the elephant and the rider. It's this idea of reparenting, where we ultimately have to take the reins and become the parent to ourselves that we didn't necessarily get when we were younger. And so just as we can see this as a revolting elephant, we can see this as a child that is throwing a tantrum. I don't want to do this. I don't want to get in the pool. And we're saying to the child, well, you've got to learn how to swim. This is something that's important that you learn how to do. But the child is afraid of getting in the pool because it's scary to the child. We know rationally as the adult that there's nothing to be afraid of. But the child is responding from a very emotional, visceral place. So how do you deal with the child? You have to approach that in a very skillful, creative way. And you approach it with this enveloping acceptance of the child, where you are attuned to the child, right? So radical self-acceptance, delusional self-acceptance is really all about maintaining that attunement and connection with ourselves. And so then we find a strategic way to ease the child, to ease the elephant back in the direction of the river. And we just experiment, just as you would do with a child or with the horse or the elephant. You'd feel it out and say, okay, well, let's try this, etc. Right? So self-acceptance is key. And then eventually, as you establish rapport with the child, as you establish rapport with the elephant, you find that you're able to do things together in an integrated way. You hear me talk a lot about integrity. Integrity is the heart and the soul of what it is that I am up to here with Creator Parish. That's why it's called the Creative Integrity System, the Creative Integrity Framework. This is all about developing integrity, integration, becoming more whole, becoming an integer, becoming a whole person. As you reestablish that rapport, you find that you're able to do things that you weren't able to do in the past. So you're able to be more consistent than you were in the past. You're more comfortable posting on social media, having a public-facing image. You're more comfortable making the YouTube video or recording the podcast or whatever it is. So the wheels are staying on the bus for longer, right? Rather than breaking down on the on-ramp and you're on the side of the road on the on-ramp before you ever get to the freeway, you find that you actually got on the freeway. Now, you had your hazards on and you only went 45 miles an hour and you got off at the next exit, but you actually made it down the freeway without the wheels falling off. So this is the second of these sub-principles, which I call self-trust. So self-trust is when you trust that you, and through experience, you trust that you can do things that you weren't able to do before, right? So once you do this and you're able to get up to 55 miles an hour, you're able to get up to 65, you're able to get up to 70, the self-trust just deepens, the integration deepens, the rapport between the elephant and the rider deepens. And that gives rise to the third of these sub-principles, which is self-belief. So self-trust, for me, is very much about the near term. It's about the here and now. Can I do this thing right now successfully without the resistance taking me down or the ADD or whatever it is? Can I achieve this goal this week on this day that I said I was going to do? Once you get that experience built up and you establish that self-trust, self-belief is more of a long-term belief in yourself. It's grounded in the experience that's come from the self-trust, but you now have a forecasting in terms of what is possible for you and what is possible in your life. That is something that is uplifting, right? Because now you can align with that North Star and know that it's realizable, right? You can sense a kind of inevitability when you see that you can do X, Y, and Z that you've never been able to do before, and you feel into that in connection with where it is that you want to go. You're like, I can get there, right? So then the big picture goals start to become energized and you become motivated and more aligned with where it is that you ultimately want to go, right? So the elephant whisper is kind of a big deal, right? This is kind of the crux of the whole thing, is how you understand yourself. And the last thing I'll share with you is another framework, and this comes from the world of holistic health. Anybody who's been in the world of health and wellness and medicine has learned about the 8 attributes. So the 8 attributes are something that you ask about anybody who is coming in with any condition, just to get a baseline of what's going on. So if somebody's coming in with a pain condition, you want to know what's the location of the pain, what's the intensity of the pain, what's the quality, what are the exacerbating factors, what are the alleviating factors, what's the context, all of these kinds of things. So the 2 components of the 8 attributes that are relevant here and incredibly useful as a kind of mindset framing are frequency and duration, right? So this is back to this idea of coasting versus failing, and reconciling this reality, this inevitability of failing, of falling out of the saddle. So how do you turn a failure into a success? How do you reframe the failure as a success? Well, if your baseline, as it was for me, is that when you fall out of the saddle and you're not engaged, you're not on top of things, that you stay out of the saddle for 2 or 3 months. Like once I'm out, I'm out. It's like I've fucked up again. Here, I did it again. And then I'm just coasting. I'm just not engaged. Right? So that's the baseline. Right? So we accept ourselves where we are. That's where we began. That's just the reality of it. As we start to implement this with an improved mindset, with a deeper resolve, with some help perhaps along the way, with some people that you find who are doing the kinds of things that you're doing, and you start to fall into step with how they do what they do, you start to kind of get some things figured out. And what used to be a 2-month period of time where you were offline ends up becoming something that's maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Right? So if you fall off the saddle and you are not engaged in the system, and you get back engaged after 2 weeks and before it used to be 2 months, that is a huge win. Like legit win. This isn't just a mind trick or some kind of hack. Like that is legitimately a huge improvement, right? And so then that's your new baseline, is 2 weeks. It's like, well, I know if I fall out of the saddle, I'm going to be out max 2 weeks. Like that's what I know about myself. And then you see, because you're tracking it, you've got the checklist, and you've got all of these things to stay aware of what it is that's going on. You see that then turns into a week. So that is kind of where I am. My worst period of time right now, where I'm not plugged into my system, is about a week. It's generally around 2 or 3 days, right? If something takes me down and I get pulled out of being in that, what I like to call the meta mode, where you're in this kind of metacognitive mode where you are able to stay on top of all the projects and all the moving pieces and stay engaged with all of the tools. If I get taken out of that, it's usually a couple, 3 days, and at the most a week, right? So that is a really important piece of this. And it's also about the frequency. How often do you get knocked out of the saddle? How often are you failing to, be engaged with the systems? And you see that also improves. So this is a framing that shifts the attention to the reality that you are actually improving. The transformation is happening. You are growing your wings. It is like the Wright brothers, I'm sure their experience of getting their first plane off the ground. It's like, how long do the wheels stay off the runway? Each time the wheels are off the runway a little bit longer. And each time it sets down for a shorter period of time. The number of times that you've got to come down and touch the runway before you achieve liftoff becomes fewer and fewer as time goes on. Okay? So this is the elephant whisperer principle. Become an elephant whisperer. Don't be so hard on yourself. Right? Find a way to earn the trust of the elephant, so that when you do get to a point, there are going to be deeper rivers at some point. And once you get to those rivers, if you've done this and you've had this attitude, this self-accepting attitude, and you've gone through this process of working through this with yourself in this way, the elephant is going to trust you when you say, hey, there's this thing, we got to do it. Like we got to do this thing. The elephant's going to be like, I'm freaking terrified. But okay, let's do it. I'm all in. All right. So then you have this kind of unified experience of facing challenges. And rather than being terrified, at least that's been my experience, rather than having this kind of muffled terror that creeps up, it's an excitement. You're nervous. There's anxiety. But it is the butterflies kind of anxiety, where you can reframe it as excitement, and lean into it and take action and do the thing that you know that you need to do. All right, so those are the more navel-gazy principles, and I don't mean to discount their value, but they are more inwardly focused. And now we're going to make a bridge into the more tactical, more practical side of things, which is about actually using these systems. So the first principle here, so this is our principle number 4, is to not deify the system. A lot of people, whether it's a system or it's a routine, they see the system and the routine as being an end unto themselves. So it's like, if I check the box and I wake up at 6 o'clock and I do the cold plunge and I do the meditation, if I check those boxes, then I win, right? I can pat myself on the back and I've actually achieved something. If I have this goal that I've set and I put it on the calendar to do this thing at this time, and I do that thing, then I win because I did the thing that I said I was going to do at the time that I said I was going to do it. Now, there's definitely a relationship here, but what I'm trying to get at is that as soon as the system and the scheduling of the time blocks and so forth, as soon as that becomes rigid and the clay hardens, the way forward is not to be a slave to this calcified system. The way forward is to break the calcified system and reimagine how to engage with the system anew and afresh, right? So we can't hold the system and the structure of the system as sacrosanct. We have to recognize that the system is here to serve us as we go about bringing our product to market. And so to the extent that it serves that, then it becomes important that we plug into it and that we honor it and that we value it. But as soon as it doesn't, we have to put our chips with ourselves and trust ourselves that this isn't really working anymore. This isn't actually helping us. It isn't actually serving the project. So we're going to be getting more into that in the next principle, in principle 5. But that's one of the things that oftentimes happens when we deify the system is we think it's this top-down thing, and we just need to force ourselves to do the thing that's on our calendar. And if we do that thing, then we get a sticker. And if we don't, we get a slap on the wrist. Like that's not the way to think about it. And then the second piece of this we've already covered, which is that we can't expect ourselves to be 100% engaged all of the time, for a couple of reasons. For one, there's the transition that we're going through, this development of ourselves as an operator, as a solopreneur, where we're not going to be 100% engaged all the time. We have to embrace that. We have to have the self-compassion to be accepting of that fact. But there's also the recognition that the system, in a way, is a kind of guardrail. All right, so if you imagine a bowling ball going down a bowling lane towards the pins, the system is in a lot of ways a means of directing the chaos of our creative process. And so the system needs to bring up the guardrail as we're approaching the gutter, and learn from that so that we can have guardrails in place in the areas that we tend to go in the gutter. But the goal isn't the guardrail. The goal is to get the bowling ball to the pins. And there are people who have very loose systems. There are certain systems that they have in place that may just be, it's not formal at all. There are people who don't have regular routines that they do every morning. And yet they live very productive, very fulfilled lives. So if a part of the system is not being engaged with, is not being plugged into, we have to be able to accept that and recognize that the system isn't the goal. Having the perfect guardrail isn't the thing that we're after. We're after guardrails that are actually functionally serving us as we go about bringing our vision to life. All right, so that's principle 4. Don't deify the system. If becoming an elephant whisperer is the heart and soul of these 6 principles of organic productivity, Principle 5 is the blueprint, right? So this is where things get really tactical. So I really want you to pay attention to this, because this is really what differentiates this organic productivity set of principles from the other approaches to productivity that you will likely have encountered. So the 5th principle is to build from the bottom up, right? So we've already kind of intimated about the top-down intuition that we have. It's like, all right, this is the perfect system. This is the perfect calendar. I have, as the writer, decided that these are the things that are going to work. And if I do these things, then I will get this outcome. And so then you impose that on your calendar, you impose it on yourself, and you expect it to be this kind of plug and play solution. And then you actually get into the thick of it, and you find that you rebel, you resist, you don't fit into that square hole. So the antidote to a top-down approach is a bottom-up approach. So tactically speaking, there's 2 aspects of this. The first aspect is, I think about in terms of tracking and reviewing. So using the calendar. So the calendar is one of the 3 main tools in the creative integrity system. This is one of the tools that you find basically in any productivity system is going to use Google Calendar or some kind of calendar app. And typically, like I said, what you do is you say, okay, well, I've got these time blocks available in my day, so I'm going to dedicate this time block to this thing, and I'm going to dedicate this time block to that thing. That's top down. Bottom up, the way that you use the calendar in a bottom-up approach is that you allow yourself to do what you want to do in that time block. But you track by adjusting the time block in terms of the name of the event and the duration of the time, the start and the stop time that you actually spent doing the thing. So the calendar, rather than being a forward-looking, now we're going to get there in the second part about the forward-looking component of this, but at this stage, the calendar, instead of being a forward-looking projection of what you want to do, becomes a backward-looking reflection of what you've actually done, right? So, and in the iDropShip system, you categorize these time blocks according to developing something, refining something, etc. This iDropShip kind of framing. So you can go back and you can see, okay, left to my own devices, left to my own creative inspiration, maybe you had a floating goal or a floating deadline, whether it went in the calendar or not. This idea is like, okay, well, I kind of want to do this on Mondays, or I kind of want to get this done by this date. You track what it is you actually did, how much time you spent doing it, and you can look back then. So this is the reflecting piece or the reviewing piece at the end of the week during your weekly review, and you can assess how much time you spent working on these specific aspects of this particular project. AI, by the way, is incredibly helpful for this. You can train AI through Cowork. You can build a tool that can actually go into your calendar and extract for you and create a graph for you of all of the different components of what it was that you worked on. So you are basically getting an imprint, or it's kind of like a mold of what your natural proclivities are, what your natural rhythms are, what it naturally takes you in time-wise to do these various things. Then once you start to get a sense of your natural rhythms, you can then, this is the second piece of this, the second aspect, is you can start forecasting based on your natural rhythms. So you start casting the net then into the future and setting those repeat calendar events where it's like, okay, well, it seems like during this period of time, this is what is the most natural thing for me to do. So on Mondays, from 2 to 4, this is the time that I'm going to do this. And you put that there and you see how it fits with the rhythms of your own, sensibilities during that time. As you go through this, as you develop as the integration between the rider and the elephant becomes deeper, the rider has more leverage in terms of being firm about these forecasted time blocks. And you also have the momentum and the inertia and the identity change, the working in your favor. We're going to be talking about all of those things next, where the rhythm just becomes more established. And you're like, okay, at 11 o'clock, that's when I start recording. And 11 o'clock isn't something that I just came upon because I've decided that's when I have the free time. 11 o'clock is what I've arrived at through trial and error, through looking back and reviewing and seeing what's working and what's not working, taking notes about it, using the journal. It's one of the other main tools, and getting a sense of what these sweet spots are for doing various aspects of the work. Getting a sense of how long certain things take, in reality, how long something's going to take, so that when you're forecasting, you can allot for that amount of time for that particular aspect of your project. So this is really the blueprint in a very tactical way of what differentiates organic productivity. It's the same tools. You're going to find people talking about using your journal, using a calendar system, using checklists. These are universal tools that people use. But the way in which you use them, and in particular the way you relate to using them, right? And the attitude you have towards yourself, towards failing versus coasting, towards this being a developmental process, towards the system not being sacrosanct unto itself. You know, all of these things completely change how you can relate to these systems. So just for example, with respect to the Creator Parish calendar that I have, when I started this particular iteration of it and started making these videos, I completely eliminated all of the repeat calendar events on my calendar for Create or Perish. Blank slate. Now, I'd already established certain rhythms and certain habits that gave me a certain tendency and proclivity towards doing these certain things at a particular time. But rather than having a calendar that was awaiting me, I was like, all right, well, it's Monday and it's this time. And so now I'm going to get to work. I start the time block, and I've got a timer. I don't do this while I'm recording, but I've got a timer that I set, and this brings time one into the mix. This is the scaffolding, right? I don't do well with time one, but if I have this timer going, and I always set the timer going upwards, never down, so I can glance over and I can say, okay, well, it's been a half an hour. Okay, it's been 45 minutes. Okay, it's been an hour. And, I can use that to gauge whether or not it's time to take a break and so forth. And then I go back into the calendar when I stop and adjust the calendar event to reflect how much time I actually spent doing that thing. And then I look back on the week. I can look back on last week and I can say, okay, this new iteration of what it is that I'm doing, I was able to do the operations, is the O in iDrop Ship, in terms of setting up the lighting and setting up the recording equipment. I did that in 10 minutes, right? And so, it just creates a new form, a new structure that is based on the reality, the living reality of the rhythms of what I'm actually doing that I can then forecast onto future weeks. So I would say, as one final piece of advice on this principle, whenever you find that something on your calendar it creates tension in you when you see it, delete it. Just delete it from your calendar immediately, right? Because that's a sign that it's not actually serving you, right? This isn't, the calendar isn't in charge. The calendar isn't telling you what you should do. You are telling the calendar what it is that's important. And then if that's living, right, if it's not this ossified part of the calendar, if that's living and reflective and useful and important, then you can let the calendar tell you what to do, right? Because then the calendar is actually supporting you And you can, as you hear said in these circles oftentimes, be a slave to your calendar. Well, yeah, then you can be a slave to your calendar, and you don't have to think about it. You just do what the calendar says that you need to do next. But the calendar, the system, the entire system is a living system. It's an organic system that is responsive to your ultimate objective, which is having a deadline, shipping the thing, and getting the thing to the person who is looking for it. All right, so that's principle 5. So that's building from the ground up. And that's an endless process. It never stops. You never figure it out. You never have the perfect system. You change, your situation changes, the expectations of you and the work that you're doing change. Right, so having this kind of flexible, dynamic, responsive, reciprocal relationship with your system is really what it's all about. So the 6th and the final principle is the skillful application of discipline. All right, so this was in the title of the video. It's about becoming a disciplined person. Okay, so there's a few things I have to say about discipline. The first is, and this is a secret about discipline, what most people see from the outside looking in as discipline isn't discipline. It's actually a habit, right? Where you've built a habit, you've developed a habit, and that habit is something that is relatively effortless to keep going. What they see is an identity shift. So this is back to the chrysalis idea, becoming the kind of person that does X, Y, and Z. I used to use this when I was working with people as an acupuncturist who were quitting smoking. I would say, how much willpower does it take when you go down the pork rinds aisle? How much effort does it take you to resist buying a pack of pork rinds? All right, and they say, I don't even think about it. I don't even know where the pork rinds are in the store. I said exactly. Right, so the shift here is getting to the point where your identity is such that you just don't even see the cigarettes as an option. You don't have that emotional connection. Right, so this is a big thing with fitness. This is a big thing with getting to bed at a certain time or getting up at a certain time. As soon as the identity shifts, then there is a kind of motivational alignment to stay true to the identity that you have that governs your behavior around certain things, right? So there are habits, and then there are these identity shifts that motivate behavior. And then there's the flywheel effect. There's the effect where you start actually making connection with people. You start actually making contact. You've got gigs on your books. You've got people that got phone calls scheduled with. You have people lined up for the podcast. You have a cycling of this energy where you're putting stuff out there and people are getting stuff back to you. And that is feeding through the system because the system is serving that process. The things in the system are vitalized by the work because the work is vitalized because your purpose is connected to the people who are, on the receiving end of that. So that lifeblood that fuels the flywheel, that flywheel has a momentum that you are basically just kind of stepping into. At Friday at 11 o'clock, you've got a podcast interview scheduled. So you show up and that door opens and you step into the door and you do the thing. And then after the interview, the door closes and that's done. But then you have to edit that. But you know that the people who have been listening to the podcast are expecting that podcast to launch. So you have that relational piece of it that is then working back. You've got a deadline based on connection, based on impact, based on getting this to the people who are looking for it, that then motivates you to do the input goals and to do the editing and to get the thing published in, according to whatever schedule you're on. Right. So that's a very important piece of this. So I have people tell me how, friends of mine, people in my family say, "Oh, you're a really disciplined person." And I'm always surprised when they say that, because I don't feel like I'm a disciplined person. I feel like I'm a very undisciplined person. But when I take a step back and look at what it is they're speaking to, it's very true, because the habits that I have developed there's a lot of consistency in my life. There's a lot of routine in my life, but it's not effortful for me. This is a very Taoist kind of sensibility. The ground up piece of this is like, tapping into the natural rhythms of the day, tapping into your own natural rhythms and your own natural proclivities. It's something where you're not fighting with things, you're not forcing things to happen, you're just finding where the natural flows are, and you're relinquishing control to some degree, and allowing things to be what they want to be. That being said, discipline is a very important ingredient in this. But it's important to recognize that discipline is not what you put in your fuel tank. This is not what you're running on all the time. So a lot of times people who struggle with this, who struggle with ADHD and that kind of thing, this was certainly my experience with this, is being somebody who was not able to maintain a regular routine with things. I was on the outside looking in at people who were, dialed in with things, who had habits and had routines and had flywheels that were sustaining their lives. From the outside looking in, it seemed like they were just very disciplined all the time, because the only time I was able to be consistent was when I was forcing myself to be consistent. And so I thought, well, you just have to force yourself to do this thing all the time. And that's not the case. So this is very much in line with Angela Duckworth's work on grit. Her work, if you are not familiar, basically showed that this capacity for grit, for enduring uncomfortability and difficulty when the going gets tough, and persisting in the face of that, is much more predictive of positive outcomes like life satisfaction, earning potential, relationships, and the like. These things were much more powerfully correlated to having grit versus having something like a high IQ. But what she also said, and what most people missed, was that grit is something that you bring out in the edge cases. Grit isn't something that you're using all the time. So I see discipline as being like this, where you are, if the effort that you're putting into something, like me making this video right now, there were a lot of challenges in the last couple of days that I faced in making this video. I won't bore you with them, but it required a certain amount of effort for me to see it through. Where I am now in the game, I would say that effort level was maybe like a 6 or a 7. I didn't get stressed out about it. It wasn't fun, but it was the work. Like, this was just the work. Okay, this isn't going to happen today. This is going to have to happen tomorrow. So that's the daily grind. The daily grind, you want to be peaking at about 6 or a 7. Every once in a while, maybe you get to an 8. With discipline is something where once you recognize that something is slipping and that thing is vital to the mission, that thing is vital to keeping the train on the tracks, you are dialing it up to a 9 or a 10. This is all hands on deck. This is a kind of obsessive, preoccupation with whatever that thing is. So you are anticipating ahead of time, okay, this is what's happening. And the journal is the way into this for me, because the journal is the place where you can really be honest with yourself about it. And then the exercise that you go through in the creative integrity system, you're kind of going through and basically identifying the specific foundational elements that are necessary to keep your life stable and to sustain yourself as an operator as you go through this process. Once you identify what that thing is, then you dial it up to a 9 or a 10, and you've got, I've got things on the board right here in front of my desk. I've got things on my checklist that are outlined in red. And so it's kind of like a full court press for maybe a week or two to get that specific thing back on track. So again, the system is being bent and modified and shaped to reflect the current needs of the moment right now. Right. So discipline is something that you use very skillfully. It's not something that you need to be super disciplined all the time. There's got to be slack in the line. There's got to be room for you to be a human, and to not be 100% perfect all the time. But as I was saying with the bowling analogy, you want to try to make sure that the momentum of the chaos, which is your life, which is your creative project, is oriented more or less in the right direction, right? If you can get that ball rolling in the right direction and more or less keep yourself from falling into the gutter, life is good. You have won. So in my experience, if you have a good system and if you have a good framework, then your discipline is really most effective when you're applying it to the system itself. Because if the system is actually serving you, if it's holistic enough to bring into focus things like renewal and nourishment, this is the very first thing in this exercise, this journaling touchstone, is renewal and nourishment. How am I doing in terms of filling my own cup? How am I doing in terms of, being plugged into the things and the people that sustain me as a human being? That's the first thing, right? So if your system is something that is comprehensive in that way, then the system becomes the thing that is going to get to the heart of that problem and resolve the issue, right? So for me, I see the journal in the creative integrity system as being like the stirrup to get back into the saddle. So you open up the journal, you go through the exercise, you go through this list, and nourishment and renewal is the first thing that you see. So, all right, how am I doing there? And if you're not doing good, you circle it and you write a few lines about it. And then you can make adjustments with the checklist, right? So if you are slipping and you're struggling and you have a system that works, then the discipline where you dial it up to 10 is like, I'm going to do the journal. I'm going to do the journal exercise. It's not part of my habit. It's not part of my routine. The elephant is resisting because it knows that this is going to bring it into the thing that it's afraid of, but I'm going to do it anyway, right? And you roll up your shirt sleeves and you do it. We're working with the calendar, using the calendar in the way that I've described it, where you are doing, like right now I'm inside of a time block. Like I've closed out the time block where I did the operational piece, I did the setup and I tracked that. I am inside a time block right now where I am recording this. And this is the production, the P part of the drop, I drop ship. As soon as I stop recording and I upload the file to the external drive, I go into the calendar and I adjust the time block to reflect the time that I spent here. To develop that habit takes discipline. If you don't have that habit, then you have to decide to make yourself do that thing. Work with the elephant, come up with creative ways to get that thing done so that that thing becomes a habit, because you know that once it is a habit, that is actually going to serve your project. It's going to serve your creative inspiration and what it is that you're here ultimately to do. So that's it for the 6 principles of organic productivity. I hope that you found it insightful. And in this case, I hope you found it practically useful, because this is not just something that is, interesting or insightful. It's something that can actually be applied. And if you're interested in the creative integrity system or the creative integrity model, by all means, please come and check out the community. This is a free school community, and I've got some deep dive explorations of the system and of the overall framework that you may find interesting. If you found this interesting, if you're still here at the end of this video, then you might dig that. So please come say hello. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.